They led double lives.
I couldn't tell my family or my friends, my kids, my wife. No one could I tell what did I really do.
Guarding America's secrets in the Cold War's darkest hours.
It was a black program. The contractors were invisible. Work was invisible.
A top-secret operation, now declassified.
Our mission was to take photographs of the Soviet Union.
Revealing a cloak-and-dagger world of robotic satellites and orbiting spy stations.
For a rocket engineer, this was the most amazing capability possible.
Until now, few have known how spies in space changed the course of the Cold War.
In many ways, the shadow space race was far more important than the publicly visible space race.
The Soviet Union and United States have split the atom and divided the planet. The Cold War threatens to turn red hot.
The Cold War became this competition between two fundamentally different ideological visions of how human societies work. The world was looking both to the United States and to the Soviet Union for models of how to modernize their own societies. The space race becomes a litmus test of the two superpowers' abilities to bring humanity into the modern age.
America, the wealthiest nation on Earth, gets caught up in a space craze.
The space age really infused the culture.
For the boys of today, the spacesuit has replaced the cowboy outfit of an earlier year.
Everybody was in a space mood, and it became a way of identifying who was thinking upward and outward, who was thinking futuristically. Don't forget all of the automobiles sported rocket-like tail fins, because that was the future.
But while America dreams of space, when it reaches for the stars, it seems to keep crashing back to Earth. The U.S. space program can't seem to get out of its own way. A string of embarrassing failures sets a sharp contrast to its biggest rival.
During the first decade, it's pretty clear that the Soviets are winning the space race. They beat the Americans into space with the first artificial satellite in October of 1957, Sputnik. They beat the Americans into space with the first living being, the dogs, Laika and then Belka and Strelka. They beat the Americans into space with the first human being, Yuri Gagarin, in April of 1961, then the first woman into space in June of 1963. Things really were going the Soviet way.
Soviet successes aren't just PR victories. Armed with the bomb, they cast a shadow of fear across America.
And what was critical was if the Soviets could launch these satellites, the same rockets could launch nuclear warheads that could be sent from the Soviet Union to hit the United States.
Americans are terrified of a surprise attack and fear what's hiding behind the Iron Curtain.
The Soviet Union was a very closed society, and we had no means of really understanding what was happening in this very, very large area. We didn't have the ability to put human spies in to gain information.
Desperate to learn what the Soviets are up to, America dedicates billions of dollars and recruits thousands of the nation's top scientists and engineers to a single covert mission: high-tech spying from space. Here, once classified films and animations show the scale of the military's plan, sending robotic cameras into space. And, even more ambitious, putting manned military stations in orbit. Crucially, the world focuses on another space program, Apollo's moon mission. While NASA's Dream Team gets all the attention, the military develops a parallel top-secret program.
All of that was highly classified and we couldn't talk about.
In the 1960s, Robert Crippen can't discuss any part of what he does.
Okay, I'm afraid I can't go in too much detail on that.
For these astronauts, it's just name, rank, and serial number.
My name's Richard Truly.
But today, for the first time, they can tell the whole story.
Richard Truly, take one.
Now, 50-some-odd years later, I can talk about it. But at that time, it was an introduction to a world that I didn't know existed.
Even the astronaut selection process is a mystery.
So they had a selection, and they never asked us whether we wanted to or not. They just assumed that we did, which was correct.
I was wildly happy. Here I was, 28 years old, and I was going to get a chance to do something I'd been dreaming about. It was a good time, highlight of my life.
Crippen and Truly are test pilots, but their training to become astronauts will push them to a new level.
It was considered the best way to train pilots for spaceflight was to subject them to the extremes of the environment they were likely to see. So there were disorientation trainers. There were vehicles that would tumble the astronauts in all three dimensions all at once to make them disoriented and to test their ability to reorient themselves and achieve a stable position again using systems like in the spacecraft. There were temperature extremes. They would put astronauts in ovens, human ovens, to assess not only their physiological but their psychological resistance to these kind of things.
After selecting their first class of astronauts, the Air Force holds just one press conference.
It was on my birthday. I was 28 years old, November 12th, 1965. And that was the last time I ever talked to the media in the program. The following morning, they introduced us to the United States' most classified and secret space programs.
They are astronauts, American heroes. But unlike the Apollo team, they won't become household names. Truly and Crippen disappear into one of the most expensive, secretive, and ambitious space programs ever conceived, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, or MOLE.
The Manned Orbiting Laboratory's purpose was very simple and straightforward, and that was to acquire very high-resolution photography of targets in the Soviet Union.
This film, recently declassified and never before broadcast, shows MOLE under construction. It's the size of a bus. At its heart is a movable 71-inch mirror for a camera that will be as big as a car. It will be by far the largest and most sophisticated spy platform in space.
Imagine the Hubble Space Telescope except pointing down.
MOLE was extremely ambitious. 50 years ago, this was the most amazing capability possible. Tracking items in the Soviet Union with a resolution of as low as 4 inches on the ground. Something that's the size of a baseball could be seen from orbit.
But America isn't looking to play ball. MOLE's focus will be on Soviet weapons systems, especially their intercontinental ballistic missiles. At the start of the space race, Americans fear that the Soviets have far more missiles and are willing to use them.
Nikita Khrushchev had a tendency to make fairly irresponsible, threatening statements on a fairly regular basis. But this was all part and parcel of projecting the image of the Soviet Union as a very powerful military presence in the world.
So the threat posed by the Soviet Union meant that there was a real fear of what people were often referred to as a nuclear Pearl Harbor. Well, I'm talking in terms of killing tens of millions of American citizens, destroying American cities, infrastructure, military forces, essentially ending the American Republic as we know it.
In the atomic age, total destruction is only minutes away. MOL could help head off a surprise attack, spotting and then monitoring Soviet missile sites. And America has learned the danger of getting caught off guard. October 4th, 1957, America gets a wake-up call from space. The Soviets launched Sputnik, the first human-made object to orbit the planet. Suddenly, the Soviet menace feels very real for many Americans.
It didn't take much imagination for people to understand in October of '57 that if the Soviets could put Sputnik into orbit, they could also deliver a nuclear payload to an American city.
Sputnik also highlights that the Soviets are racing into the future, while America seems stuck in the past.
In early September of 1957, desegregation is being implemented in Arkansas. And the Little Rock Nine has to be escorted by members of the 101st Airborne Division into schools with pro-segregationist whites holding up signs that read, "Race mixing is communism." And then 4 weeks later, you see the Soviet Union send Sputnik into space. If you are in Africa or Southeast Asia at the time, whose version of modernization are you more likely to follow? And I think in the 50s and early 60s, the answer was pretty clear. The Soviet Union was winning not only the space race, but seemed to be winning the ideological standoff.
In the Cold War, both superpowers looked to space as the new frontier and potentially the next battlefield.
In the 50s and 60s, it's important for America to put people in space as a way of showing the superiority of the American way of life. The next battlefield was in space, had to be represented by red-blooded Americans, protecting us from the communists who were sure to overrun us and subject us to their way of life.
Initial plans for MOL were straight out of science fiction, an orbiting military outpost, armed and ready for war.
Early on, the MOL was all things to all people. It had capabilities for reconnaissance, it had capabilities for intercepting of the enemy's satellites in space and negating them.
But in the final plans, MOL is an orbiting spy station. This rarely seen footage of a MOL mock-up gives a glimpse into just how big it will be. The Air Force budgets $1.5 billion in 1965, making it one of the Defense Department's most expensive programs. Each MOL would be a single-use spacecraft.
The 5 MOL vehicles were the entire production run, and it's really interesting to imagine that such an expensive, such a complex system would have been disposable.
From the start, MOL is an ambitious program with a schedule that's even tighter than the moon missions. The goal is to start launching in 1969.
The mission in space would have lasted about 30 days. Don't forget, in the 1960s, the entire worldwide experience in spaceflight was on the order of 15 or 20 days. So MOL was really pushing the envelope to promise 30-day missions repeatedly.
The first step for the MOL astronauts is to learn the basics of living and working in space. Team chemistry will be essential.
We were all pilots. We all love to fly. My fellow mole astronauts were a diverse group. We certainly weren't all alike.
We were like brothers. Great bunch of people.
To get a feel for the microgravity of space, mole crewmen start to take elliptical airplane rides.
If the pilot flying the airplane is really good, they can maintain 0G. And it's the only way on Earth that you can actually create an environment where you can test in 0G.
It's a stomach-dropping trip they nicknamed the Vomit Comet.
Early concerns about weightlessness, about things such as being able to swallow. It was seriously considered that gravity is necessary for swallowing and, of course, the rest of your digestive processes. Would your body seize up in the absence of gravity? The early concerns about spaceflight weightlessness do seem kind of laughable from our perspective now.
The mole astronauts move on to more challenging tasks, but there are limits to what they can do on 0G flights.
Problem is, it's only 30 seconds. And so to get 10 minutes of flight test takes 20 of these, and it's exhausting.
Inside one plane, they build a mock-up of the capsule the astronauts will fly, called the Gemini, and the hatch and tunnel that'll connect the Gemini to the spy laboratory. They practice moving around the tight spaces, turning on cameras and lights only when they reach 0G.
We would get airborne, and these were only 25 or 30-second intervals. And it was showtime. Both of us were in the little Gemini, and we were in full pressure suits. Turn around, take off the hatch, crawl through the tunnel, do all that. Hot, sweaty. We would get stuck, and it was hard work.
They try loading film in and out of the lab and crawling back into the Gemini capsule. They focus on the hatch, which they'll close at the end of their 30-day mission.
After the astronauts left, the vehicles would have been deorbited to keep them from falling into enemy hands and revealing American secrets to the Soviets.
While the lab burns up on re-entry, the Gemini will drop back through the atmosphere, protected by its heat shield. But Mole has a potentially fatal flaw: the specially designed hatch.
We needed a way to get from the Gemini into the laboratory, and they elected to put a hatch through the heat shield that you would remove and then crawl back through that.
Some of the flight crew thought, you know, this is crazy. Cut a hole in the heat shield, because later on, when you re-enter, you depend on that heat shield.
If the heat shield failed, you would have 5,000 degree penetration of the atmosphere, and it would cook everybody that was inside, and it would be a major catastrophe.
Well, nobody had done any of this before.
Mole will be an extremely risky venture, but America is running out of options. May 1st, 1960. Newly deployed Soviet SA-2 ground-to-air batteries swing into action. An intruder is arcing over the heart of their nation, flying out of reach of Soviet jets. At 70,000 feet, American pilot Francis Gary Powers is untouchable in his U-2. Until today. In the days following the U-2 shootdown, the U.S. intelligence community claims that it's just a weather plane blown off course. But much of the plane, including its powerful camera, survives the crash, and the cover story falls apart.
The shootdown in May 1960 proved to be a major embarrassment to President Dwight Eisenhower because of the attempted cover-up. More importantly, it cut off the only means of collecting photographic intelligence of the interior of the Soviet Union.
And the most important question in the late 1950s was the so-called perceived missile gap. The idea that the Soviets had more intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs as they were known, and that the Americans had fewer.
Without the U-2, America is flying blind.
Although photographic intelligence doesn't provide 100% of the answers, it does go a long way in providing the answers to this absolutely critical question. Where do we stand with the Soviet Union in these long-range nuclear-tipped missiles?
Premier Khrushchev wasn't shy about making statements like, "We are churning out missiles like sausages, we will bury you." We had to assume the worst-case scenario.
The U-2 is no longer an option over the Soviet Union, and Mole isn't even a pipe dream yet. America needs a plan B.
Eisenhower recognized that the U-2 would eventually be shot down, and in the background, we needed to be developing technology that would allow us to continue to understand what our adversaries were up to the day that that event occurred.
The United States started developing reconnaissance satellites in 1956, one to collect photographic intelligence, one to collect signals intelligence, that is, intercepting Soviet radars.
The first photo imaging satellite is called Corona. But on January 29, 1959, it can't even lift off the pad. One misfire is followed by 12 more attempts and 12 failures, but they can't give up.
This was a completely new technology. No one had ever done it before. But the system was so important to the United States for its potential in gathering intelligence. They did not cancel the program.
If Corona doesn't succeed, the Americans continue to have to craft foreign policy and defense spending in terms of a giant question mark regarding the Soviet threat.
Even if the military can get Corona's cameras into space, many think there's a better option: human spies.
So to have a flexible system in space, you needed to have people on board. And if you had the people on board, you need to understand what the capabilities of those people were and how to keep those people healthy and functional during the time they're in space.
In 1966, the Mole team builds an underwater mock-up off Buck Island in the Caribbean to simulate life in space. This footage gives a rare, behind-the-scenes look at the operation. Engineers and astronauts put on their diving masks and respirators, and then layer on their spacesuits filled with water. Neutrally buoyant, they can practice for as long as their air holds out.
Planning for the MOL included underwater training and, more than training, evaluation of procedures.
Unlike the 30-second zero-G flights, they can spend hours each day underwater, practicing maneuvers and passing canisters of film through the tunnel. The Mole program is progressing, but slowly and over budget.
The launch kept moving down the road. It seemed like every year it was a year away. Some technical difficulties, but it was primarily a funding issue.
5 seconds. Mark.
In contrast, the simpler, cheaper Corona has been on the fast track for several years. On August 10, 1960, with lucky number 13, Corona leaves the pad and reaches orbit.
About 24 hours later, they commanded the satellite to eject the capsule. They recovered the capsule and was brought back to the White House, and President Eisenhower and some key advisors actually had a press conference.
I am proud, Mr. President, to present you this flag of the United States of America.
The capsule and flag are the very first man-made objects to fly into space and return safely. And just 1 week later, the next Corona launches, this time with a top-secret camera on board.
And so that was a very, very small film load, only about 20 pounds, a very simple and not too capable camera.
Despite its limitations, the camera photographs 1.6 million square miles of the Soviet Union, giving America its first look behind the Iron Curtain from space. And it's eye-opening.
A senior CIA official said that the availability of Corona photography over the Soviet Union was like shining a flashlight in a darkened warehouse.
Corona, in its very first successful mission, was able to return more images from space than all of the U-2 flights combined over the Soviet Union.
We found airfields, entire cities, transportation hubs, and air defense missile complexes that were previously unknown to Western intelligence.
Most important, Corona spots all of the Soviet ICBM sites and makes a surprising discovery.
By June of 1961, the CIA estimated that, counter to Air Force fears that there were perhaps as many as 200 ballistic missile launch pads inside the Soviet Union, there were actually probably only about 10 to 25. And of that potential 10 to 25, only 6 launch sites could be confirmed. This gave us a more rational understanding of the threat we did face and the threat we didn't.
Corona shows that the missile gap is a myth. For the first time, America knows it has the upper hand in the nuclear arms race. Corona is now America's eyes in space. And a satellite called Grab is its ears, listening for Soviet radar systems.
They were very, very small, and they were very, very simple, but that small satellite carried a highly classified signals intelligence package, which was designed to intercept Soviet air defense radars. And during the roughly 3 months of operation, the Grab satellite collected so much data of Soviet radars, it took many, many months for analysts to produce finished and useful intelligence.
Knowing where those radars were located was essential information in the event that we needed to carry out a counterattack against the Soviet Union. Our bombers needed to avoid those radars in order to successfully carry out that kind of counterattack.
But these early robotic satellites were far from perfect. The cameras were pre-programmed to operate at set times, regardless of the weather.
The earliest Corona missions for the first couple of years were as much as 60 to 65% cloud covered.
When clouds obscure Corona's targets, the satellite wastes its precious film. And it can take weeks from launch to processing for analysts to determine if they have any usable intelligence. A manned station like MOL, in which people can modify the mission and give real-time updates, could solve many of these problems. In this rarely seen footage, the MOL astronauts train in a simulator.
We had the capability to look ahead of our orbital track and select targets. The decision-making that you can have with people is extremely important. Computers can't do that. That's still true today.
The need for human eyes in space comes into sharp focus as the superpowers teeter on the brink of nuclear war. October 15th, 1962. CIA photo analysts make a stunning discovery. The Soviets are building missile sites in Cuba, just 100 miles from Florida. nuclear war has come to America's doorstep.
The range of missiles that the Soviets had on Cuba was far enough to hit New York City and everything south of that. So the human catastrophe would have been unprecedented, and of course the United States would have retaliated against both Cuba and ultimately the Soviet Union.
Corona's cameras are supposed to spot these weapons, but instead, the Cuban missiles reveal the spy satellite's limitations.
Very famously, the Soviet missiles that are deployed in Cuba in 1962 are found by overhead reconnaissance, but they're not found by a Corona photo reconnaissance satellite, rather they're found by a manned U-2 photo reconnaissance aircraft. Corona actually does photograph Cuba. However, the imagery, when you look at it on a light table, is horribly cloud covered. Moreover, the Corona resolution at this time is roughly 15 feet. That's sufficient to see major infrastructure in the Soviet Union. In Cuba, by contrast, the Soviet SS-4s deployed to that island are field deployed. So because of its limited resolution and its inability to deal flexibly with weather, Corona doesn't end up adding any value to the discovery of missiles in Cuba.
It's a U-2 that first finds the missiles. But the spy plane's vulnerability is exposed again when one is shot down over Cuba and its pilot killed. America needs a spy platform that can combine the U-2's high-resolution imagery with Corona's safe overflight. MOL seems like it could be the solution, but it takes almost 5 more years to develop and begin production. The Air Force has to build and test a rocket powerful enough to lift MOL's 30,000 pounds more than 100 miles into space. On August 26, 1966, the Air Force prepares to launch a Titan IIIC, a version of the rocket that will carry MOL. It's an intercontinental ballistic missile beefed up with 2 solid fuel boosters. This mission is to carry communication satellites into orbit. The launch gives Truly, and the rest of the MOL team, a chance to see their future ride in action.
And so we decided we would go down and watch it.
20 seconds.
They counted down and
2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff. We're off on the hour.
it lifted off and went up in the air.
Looking very nice. 42 seconds.
And suddenly we saw it turning, and the range control blew it up.
With the MOL team watching, the rocket explodes into thousands of pieces. All that's lost are the satellite and the rocket. But a failure like this on a MOL launch would kill the two astronauts.
It was not a great day. But the flight crew comes from a group of people that understand risk. We knew that rockets could blow up and airplanes could crash. If you don't want to take the risk, you don't get to fly.
The inherent danger strikes home when one of the 14 MOL astronauts, Robert Lawrence, is killed in a training accident. He had been the first African-American selected to be an astronaut and a key member of the MOL team.
What did it feel like? Well, it was very sad. I'd lost friends before and lost friends subsequent to that. But there is risk involved, and that's part of life.
MOL is still years from launch, but it's not the only program that struggles to get off the ground. May 11th, 1963, a new satellite called Gambit sits on the pad when an air bubble in its fuel tank triggers the rocket's collapse. So 2 months later, they try again. The successful launch places a high-resolution camera in space for the first time.
High resolution provided by the Gambit 1 system offered a fundamentally different class of information than what you could get from Corona. High resolution spatial details of things like a Soviet naval vessel or aircraft or radar dish allowed you to start characterizing some of its operational parameters and not simply identify what it is.
By the mid-1960s, Corona and Gambit are launching almost once a month. Their success creates a whole new problem. How do you recover all this film from space? The satellite ejects a film capsule to drop northwest of Hawaii. It streaks through the atmosphere, lighting up the sky like a shooting star. A team of Air Force planes flies in a grid pattern over the ocean. Their goal, to snag the film capsule before it hits water. As a plane gets ready to make a pass, the aircrew lets out catch lines.
This is one of the hooks that the Air Force used to retrieve the very first film that was returned from space. The way the system would work is that two of these hooks would be attached to the harness out the back end of the aircraft. The aircraft would fly over the parachute, and one of these hooks would snag the parachute, and that film was returned to the United States, where it was developed and used for intelligence purposes.
Gambit, Corona, and the next generation Hexagon produce hundreds of thousands of images each year, cataloging the Soviet arsenal. But the agency in charge of the satellites, and MOL, the National Reconnaissance Office, is invisible to the public.
The National Reconnaissance Office was not publicly acknowledged from the time that it was established in 1961 until 1992.
To keep the Soviets guessing about these programs, everyone involved maintains a wartime level of security.
So the fact that I worked on top secret programs meant I couldn't tell my family or my friends, my kids, my wife. No one could I tell what did I really do. But there were certain words that were taboo to use on the telephone. You couldn't use the word camera. And the most taboo word to use was the word film, because film automatically means taking pictures, cameras. When we went on trips, we were told several times by the CIA, you can't stay in this particular hotel because they knew that some of the rooms were bugged.
Not only did the programs not exist, the National Reconnaissance Office didn't exist, and the security system didn't exist. It was invisible.
But as MOL gears up and thousands begin to work on it, the budget balloons from $1.5 to $3 billion. There's just no way to pretend it doesn't exist.
It would be hard for the Department of Defense to not publicly state that there was a program. It was too visible from that standpoint. However, they had an unclassified mission for us that was doing experiments on orbit, that sort of thing. So the real mission was very heavily classified.
November 3rd, 1966. Less than 3 months after the Titan 3C explosion, MOL faces a crucial test that can only be done in public. The Air Force gives it a trial run. They load a MOL laboratory mock-up onto the Titan 3C, make last-minute checks, and then top it with the Gemini capsule that has been uniquely modified for MOL.
The idea was we were going to test an unmanned Gemini capsule with a hatch cut in it. They had to cut this hatch into the heat shield, which made it potentially a failure point when you were re-entering.
If the heat shield fails on this trial run, it will be a major setback, likely killing the program.
All systems are good, and with the launch vehicle on the pad.
Go ahead.
The manned orbiting laboratory will be one of the biggest payloads ever carried into space. It will get there on a Titan 3C, the most powerful rocket of its time.
We had a Titan 3C that was going to fly out of the Cape Canaveral that had a mock-up of our lab and the Gemini spacecraft.
Quarters to fast speed.
T-minus 30 seconds and counting. All final checks in the countdown, still looking good at this time.
The future of Mole rides on this launch.
0. Ignition.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff at 16 minutes after the hour. Climbing very nicely. We have a roll program initiated.
The Titan lifts the Mole mock-up and Gemini into orbit, accelerating to almost 17,500 miles per hour. But the biggest test is still to come. Will the heat shield's access hatch hold up or fail on re-entry?
We have staging, and it's been confirmed here on the ground.
After traveling 5,500 miles, the Gemini drops back through the atmosphere. Temperatures can reach 5,000 degrees. Parts of the heat shield melt off, spraying onto the windows. The capsule splashes down in the South Atlantic.
Roger, will do.
And Navy rescue divers scramble to keep it afloat and secure lines for retrieval. Hauling it aboard the USS LaSalle is a lot less high-tech. The exterior is charred. Mole engineers have to pry open the doors. But once inside the capsule, they discover that the interior is undamaged. The hatch in the heat shield held, and Mole has cleared a critical hurdle. But while Mole inches forward, the world is changing much faster. By the mid-1960s, Corona and Gambit are operating smoothly, collecting images of missile sites and weapons systems across the Soviet Union.
What Corona provided was a broad area scan or broad area search capability. The Gambit system was more of a point imaging system. In a way, the Gambit system was like a U-2 in space. It allowed us to type out and identify different types of bomber aircraft, different types of transport aircraft, even different naval vessels from one another.
By 1966, the two satellites can tag team any site in the Soviet Union.
So say a missile silo was identified on the Corona system, the Gambit system would be programmed to come and look at that particular missile silo, but at much higher resolution. The later generation Gambit system, we were able to identify objects that were smaller than 1 foot in size.
Teamed with improved radar and signals detection, they provide critical information on the Soviet military.
They each provided a unique contributing piece of information that, assembled with another piece of information, gave us greater insight into the intelligence challenge that we were trying to solve.
With satellites passing overhead almost continuously, the Soviets realize they're being watched.
There are many stories that I have heard of Soviets writing things in the snow or using dirt or other marking agents to communicate things to the Americans. Many of these are unrepeatable four-letter words.
Ground-based controllers can remotely reprogram these satellites, making them much more versatile. The later generations are designed to carry much more film and multiple film buckets, so they can stay in orbit longer. Robotic satellites with high-resolution cameras fill much of the role planned for Mole, with one important difference.
Robotic missions are also going to be substantially cheaper than piloted missions. Or if you spend the same amount of money, you can get more capability out of a robotic mission.
By 1969, Vietnam is consuming most of the defense budget. And every program comes under close scrutiny. MOL is running almost 3 years behind schedule and more than $1 billion over budget.
When you put humans in space, it is very, very expensive. It is very, very complex. And ultimately, President Nixon canceled the program.
This morning, the chairman and members of the appropriate House and Senate committees were informed that the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, MOL program, has been canceled by the Department of Defense.
The announcement comes just 6 weeks before Apollo 11's moon mission.
Suddenly, the program that we had thrown ourselves into so much to make work was just gone. The program was gone.
It was devastating is the way I reacted. You know, as good as it felt when I was selected, it was 180-degree opposite of how it was when it went away. So it was certainly one of the low periods in my life.
We thought we were gonna fly in space, and suddenly our ride was yanked. And I didn't know what I was gonna do.
Almost immediately, the whole MOL program is shut down, scrapped, or recycled.
The 71-inch mirrors that would have been used in each of the MOL vehicles eventually found their way into a telescope that was used to study the depths of the universe.
Half of the MOL astronauts, including Robert Crippen and Richard Truly, transfer to NASA.
It was night and day. Suddenly we were going from a program that was at the heart of the Cold War, but invisible, to NASA, who encouraged their astronauts to get publicity.
Despite their years of training and experience with MOL, Truly and Crippen have to start at the back of the line at NASA.
The dream of all astronauts is they want to fly in space. And until you do, you're not sure you're ever going to get there.
Until 1978, all they can do is train for the space shuttle and hope for a chance.
The big boss at that time at Flight Crew Ops was a guy called George Abbey. George says, "Crip, how'd you like to fly this first space shuttle?" And I was ready to turn handsprings.
It takes Crippen 15 years to reach space.
I was 28 when I was selected for the MOL program. I was 43 when I flew that first flight. So tenacity sometimes pays off for you.
Over those same 15 years, spy satellites proved that the Soviet nuclear threat is not as bad as feared, and America's atomic anxieties ease.
One of the major legacies then of 1960 space reconnaissance is peace and stability to a degree. The ability to have a firm, rational, evidence-based understanding of the adversary's capabilities, I would argue, drastically reduced the likelihood of accidental nuclear war.
In 1972, America and the Soviet Union signed SALT I, the first in a series of arms control agreements. And in July of 1975, for the first time, the two superpowers link up in space with the Apollo-Soyuz mission.
Apollo-Soyuz was important because it allowed us to find out that we could work with the Soviets on things like space and be productive together. Space is a good way to bring nations together. It really is.
Robert Crippen lives every astronaut's dream, flying into space on board the shuttle 4 times. And on Richard Truly's 44th birthday, he reaches space.
I first got to fly the Enterprise on top of the 747, and then I turned around and commanded a Challenger. It was a thrill.
He retires from the Navy as a vice admiral. While Mole faded into the shadows, it played a crucial role in the evolution from paranoia to peace.
There weren't a lot of good things going on in the 60s. About the only thing that Americans could dream about was the magic mission of Apollo. But invisible to the public, a lot of people, including me, were working to win the Cold War and gain peace, and it was a marvelous experience.